Years of mutual blows, and suddenly a half-turn towards a deal. The US and China are trying a pause instead of another round of sanctions. On Saturday, October 25th, Washington and Beijing unexpectedly showed a willingness to de-escalate. For many years, relations have been on the brink. Trade tariffs, technology bans, mutual accusations of espionage, and cyberattacks. Against this backdrop, any rapprochement seemed unrealistic. Now there is a chance for a short respite, not peace, but a pause that both sides can use pragmatically and without unnecessary illusions. On October 26th, two strong signals were sent. The parties announced a preliminary trade agreement and a deal to sell the American segment of TikTok. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said in an interview with CBS that Washington and Beijing had agreed on a scheme whereby American investors would buy TikTok's U.S. operations. According to Bessent, the deal is essentially done and ready to be finalized. At the same time, he emphasizes that legal and technical steps remain ahead: documentation, agreement on details, and the practical separation of the American segment of the service from the rest of the business. This new development removes the threat of a ban. The app remains, but the ownership and control structure changes. This is what should satisfy the security requirements that U.S. officials have been talking about. Control over TikTok US will be transferred to a consortium of American investors. The participants include Fox Corp, Oracle, and, according to media reports, billionaire Michael Dell. ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, will retain a minority stake of less than 20%. This means that its influence on day-to-day management, key product decisions, and algorithm policies will be minimized. Formally, the company will remain a shareholder, but without the leverage to determine the direction of the American segment. And what happens to the recommendation algorithm? After all, it was the main reason for the US's complaints. According to the agreement, this algorithm will be reconfigured and left under the technical control of the American side. In other words, critical elements: how the feed is formed, what signals are taken into account, how the rules are applied, will come under control within the US. This should alleviate concerns about possible external influence on content and strengthen the confidence of regulators. Officials say the deal is virtually closed, but emphasize that the exact legal formula, technical procedures, and completion schedule are still being worked out. Certain details are also being kept under wraps, such as how access to systems will be differentiated and where the clear boundaries between the American segment and the rest of the service's activities will lie. These issues relate to the technical and legal details that Bessent referred to. The White House's logic is as follows: we don't want TikTok to go away. We want it to stay, but we want it to be safe. The balance is clear. The service is used by more than 150 million people in the US, which is a huge audience and a real infrastructure for communication and business. The proposed structure is an attempt to combine both interests, to preserve the product for users and to provide the control that the authorities deem necessary. And all parties will be satisfied. For users, the app remains accessible. For US investors, there is real control over the American part of the service. For ByteDance, its role in the American segment is reduced, a share of less than 20% and no influence on algorithms and operational decisions. For officials, it will be an opportunity to claim that key technical nodes are now under American control. Questions remain about the cost, the exact timing of the closure, and the specific management structure at TikTok US. Details of the algorithm reconfiguration have not been disclosed. Who exactly will be responsible for the changes and what procedures they will follow? But the general direction is already clear. This was followed by a second important piece of news, which is more significant in terms of its meaning, but still cautious in its wording. The US and China announced that they had reached a framework trade agreement. This document does not yet specify any concrete figures or commitments, but it creates the basis for a personal meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, which, according to media reports, is to take place in South Korea in the coming days. According to The Guardian, the parties have agreed to extend the current trade truce and have identified areas where they are willing to seek compromise. What does the agreement cover? First, the US has promised not to impose new tariffs on 100% of Chinese goods, a measure that Trump had previously threatened to take in the event of insufficient progress in the negotiations. This means that the escalation of the trade conflict has been temporarily suspended. Second, China has agreed to increase purchases of American soybeans, one of the key export products for agricultural regions in the US. This step is beneficial to both sides. China receives a stable supply of feed crops needed for livestock farming, and the Trump administration gets the opportunity to demonstrate the success of the negotiations to its voters, especially in agricultural states, which traditionally play a major role in election campaigns. In addition to the agricultural bloc, the negotiating framework also includes more complex issues: the export of rare earth metals, measures to restrict the supply of components for synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl, and intellectual property protection issues. No specific agreements have been signed in these areas yet, but experts see the very fact that they have been included on the agenda as a sign that the parties are ready to move toward détente. Representatives of both countries speak of cautious optimism. The Chinese side has stated that the parties have reached a preliminary consensus on key issues. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described the talks as fruitful but requiring further work. Thus, the framework agreement does not yet signify a radical change in relations, but it does create space for de-escalation and for a face-to-face meeting between the leaders, which could become the main diplomatic event of the end of the year. One of the most significant points of the framework agreement was the decision to resume and expand Chinese purchases of American soybeans. This is more than just a line in the framework document. It is a clear, tangible step that simultaneously affects politics, the market, and logistics. First, the context. Soybeans became a marker of trade wars several years ago. China reduced its purchases from the U.S. and switched to Brazil. American farmers lost a major customer, and a cascade effect began in the chain from elevators to processors. Farmers' prices fell, processors' margins shrank, and export routes changed. Now the parties are trying to return to at least normal volumes, close to pre-pandemic levels. The formula is simple. Washington extends the pause in escalation and does not introduce new tariffs, while Beijing resumes purchases and gives priority to U.S. supplies. Second, the mechanics of the deal. For China, this is essentially a restart of contracts for the coming months, with an option to extend. Purchases are usually fixed in batches through traders and processors, and shipments go through two main corridors, through the ports of the Gulf of Mexico and through the Pacific coast. For Midwestern farmers, this means loading elevators and barges during the harvest season, and for logistics, it means an increase in freight and schedules at ports. The more stable the purchase schedule, the lower the risk premium in the cost of transportation. Third, the price signal. The soybean market is tied to Chicago futures, and physical prices depend on the basis, a premium or discount to the exchange price, taking into account logistics and quality. The emergence of a large buyer improves the basis in farming regions. Elevators are more willing to take volumes, processors plan to load capacity, and farmers get a more predictable price at the gate. This is politically advantageous for Donald Trump's administration. They can tell voters in Iowa and Nebraska that external demand has returned and is supporting farm incomes. Fourth, Chinese pragmatism. Soybeans are not a luxury, but a feed base for pig and poultry farming, plus raw materials for the food and oil and fat industries. Stable imports of soybeans and soybean meal are a matter of food security and shelf prices. Diversifying supply sources reduces risks. Weather disasters in Brazil, disruptions at the Panama Canal, low water levels on the Mississippi River, all of these quickly affect prices. An additional channel from the U.S. is insurance against such shocks. Fifth, verification techniques and red flags. A return to large-scale supplies means agreeing on phytosanitary requirements, an inspection regime, and clear rules for GMO lines, which dominate in the U.S. The framework usually includes quality protocols, inspection schedules, and transparent procedures for settling claims on batches so that shipments are not held up at terminals. Sixth, the impact on processing and energy. In the U.S., demand for soybean oil from biofuel projects is growing, which means that processors are interested in stable capacity utilization. Exports of whole beans to China and domestic crushing into meal and oil are beginning to balance better when the external procurement schedule is clear for the quarter ahead. And finally, seventh, the political picture. For the White House, this is a ready-made thesis. China is buying from American farmers again. For Beijing, this is not a concession under pressure, but a rational step toward food stability and price predictability. It sounds simple on the outside, but on the inside it involves complex coordination between agencies, companies, and port infrastructure. Risks remain. Any new round of tension, from technological restrictions to geopolitical incidents, could once again affect tariffs and quotas. Weather in key regions, exchange rates, and freight costs could all quickly negate the effect of the agreements. Therefore, soybeans act as a currency of exchange, and at the same time, as a test of trust. As long as the political pause holds, contracts are fulfilled, logistics work, and farmers see money. If the pause breaks, purchase schedules and price bases will be the first to diverge. The bottom line is simple. This agreement does not resolve major contradictions, but it does provide tangible results, here and now. Farmers get revenue and planning, markets get less nervousness, politicians get clear success, and trade gets a stable supply rhythm. Judging by the rhetoric of both countries, the key event in the US-China dialogue is not the text of the framework agreement itself, but the personal meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, which is expected by the end of the month. It is precisely the personal diplomacy that characterized Trump's first term that is once again coming to the fore. The White House is betting on direct contacts between leaders rather than lengthy negotiations at the delegation level. For Trump, this meeting is a chance to show that his policy of toughness is yielding results. Against the backdrop of domestic pressure, from inflation to market instability, it is important for the president to demonstrate to voters that China is making concessions and America is winning. Any pause in the trade conflict reduces business nervousness and sends a signal to investors that foreign policy is becoming more predictable. In addition, Trump's personal involvement reinforces his image as a strong leader capable of resolving international issues directly. For Beijing, the upcoming meeting is no less significant. China wants to avoid a new wave of tariffs, maintain export stability, and at the same time not appear to be the losing side. Official statements emphasize that the negotiations are being conducted on equal terms and with respect for national interests. Such rhetoric is aimed both at the domestic audience and at strengthening China's image as an independent player capable of maintaining balance in its relations with Washington. Nevertheless, one meeting will not resolve all the contradictions. Restrictions on the export of chips and technology will remain, as will disagreements on issues of sovereignty and security, primarily with regard to Taiwan. The complete abolition of existing tariffs is also not part of the current plans. At the same time, risks remain on both sides. In Washington, hawks and part of Congress are already demanding concrete guarantees and figures, rather than symbolic agreements. In Beijing, there are fears that concessions could be perceived as a sign of weakness, so official statements remain as restrained as possible. Both sides are now betting on controlled de-escalation. The documents remain framework agreements, but the meeting between the leaders should consolidate the political situation and set the contours for further negotiations. This is not a final agreement, but rather an attempt to stabilize relations and buy time for both Washington and Beijing. Analysts see the latest steps not as a breakthrough, but as a respite. Yes, the sides have lowered the temperature, but the fundamental differences remain. They lie deeper than specific deals, in technology, geopolitics, and the very model of development. The US and China have different understandings of the role of the state in the economy, rules for access to data, the degree of market openness, and the limits of security. Hence, the restrictions on chips and equipment, supply checks, data localization requirements, mutual suspicions of cyber espionage, and the struggle for critical supply chains. Even if American investors take control of TikTok in the US market, the service will remain a symbol of the clash between two logics. On the one hand, there is digital sovereignty. The state wants to control citizens' data and the risks of outside influence. On the other hand, there is the global platform economy, where algorithms, content, and advertising markets are connected across borders. Questions that will remain unanswered include: who actually controls recommendations and moderation, where data is stored, who is responsible for code security and access to it, and how to verify all this in practice. The Trade Framework Agreement is also fragile. It is based on political will and the current situation. Any surge in tension, a new dispute over technology, a geopolitical incident, or an internal political attack by opponents could bring the agenda back to tariffs and retaliatory measures. There are always forces in Washington that demand toughness and tangible concessions. In Beijing, it is important not to give the impression of concessions under pressure and to maintain control over strategic industries. In such conditions, even carefully crafted formulas can easily fall apart amid new cycles of escalation. At the same time, the pause itself has value and meaning. Businesses receive a signal of predictability, markets get a chance to breathe, and negotiation channels get time to work out the details. For users, it means maintaining access to familiar services. For regulators, it is a window of opportunity to build control mechanisms without harsh prohibitions. And yet, this is not a resolution of the conflict, but risk management in the here and now. If the leaders do indeed finalize the agreements in the coming days, this moment will go down in history as a rare case when two superpowers were able to agree on a temporary compromise. But the key word is temporary. The fate of the pause will depend on whether it is possible to turn a political gesture into working rules. Transparency of algorithms and access, understandable export and import regimes, and procedures for exchanging security information. Without this, any thaw will be short-lived until the next round of competition. The deals signed and almost agreed upon between the US and China are not peace or a new chapter in the partnership. They are a window of opportunity, a respite that could turn into either a new wave of confrontation or a slow return to pragmatism, to rules that allow trade, control risks, and keep communication channels open. The story of TikTok and the extension of the trade truce is not about trust, but about calculation. Washington seeks control and predictability where it sees security threats. Beijing seeks export stability and domestic manageability. Each side is taking steps only to the extent that they pay off. And perhaps it is precisely this cold arithmetic that is keeping the world from dangerous crossroads today. It lowers the temperature, gives the markets a breather, and gives negotiators time to turn political gestures into working rules. No 2001.